Today we have guest speaker Rob Zotti. He's with Hub International. And the reason we're talking to Rob today is because first, he's a Cyber Wyoming board member, and he's been with us for years, giving us great advice as a board member, but also because we've been seeing an increase in home-based businesses in the Made Safe program and in the cybersecurity competition. And there are probably some very interesting insurance things that we need to be talking about with Rob for these home-based businesses. And we're going to use Cyber Wyoming as an example because we are a virtual company and we have 5 different home offices. So hopefully this will help you as a home-based business or a home-based business owner or even a remote worker determine what kind of insurance you might need to protect your company and possibly even yourself as you do business in your home. So welcome, Rob. Do you want to introduce yourself and say anything?
Yeah, no, Rob Zotti with Hub International. I've been in the insurance industry as an agent for the last 25 years and a board member of Cyber Wyoming for 4 years, maybe.
Yeah,
So
it's been a while.
been a while. Yeah. So
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. We appreciate it. So the first question I want to ask you is geared towards business owners policy insurance. And I understand that, some of the questions you have to ask when you think about this type of insurance is, do you see clients in your home? Do others in your home-based business, other offices, for instance, meet clients in their home? What if someone hurt themselves in your home during a business meeting? What if the business owners and your employees come to your home and someone gets hurt? So could you kind of talk about what that means, from a business owner's policy, what it covers?
sure. So with the instances that you're saying would be a liability um, exposure that you're looking at, and people will have a homeowner's policy, and hopefully if they're renting, they have a renter's policy that does provide liability coverage for them personally. There's property coverage with those policies as well. However, those policies typically will exclude business personal property and business activity at the home. So it is important to have a separate commercial policy in place, be it a business owner's policy or commercial liability or commercial property policy in place to cover those exposures. The property for computers and the various equipment that you may have at your home, but the liability for if potentially you have clients that visit your house, they get injured, you want the liability for that. If you're traveling, you're out at a conference, you rent a hotel room, and you damage the hotel room some way, somehow, you're going to have liability there to pay for your liability, your negligence or liability in that property damage. Or at a conference and you bump into somebody, injure somebody, that business liability would be there for the bodily injury that you may be negligent for or liable for. So with that business activity, your homeowner's policy more than likely would not cover that. And
Okay.
for one, it for sure wouldn't cover the business.
Okay.
For your homeowner's policy, there may be coverage for you if you're sued personally, but in doing business activity, more than likely, you personally would be involved in the claim, and then the business as well would be named. And you want to make sure you're covering your business properly
Well,
for that exposure.
So I didn't know that business owners insurance also covered you while you're at a conference or at a
Yes.
hotel room or something. That's really interesting to me. And I never even thought about that liability. So going back to the home, what if you don't see clients in your office? What if you always see clients and meet them at the local Chamber of Commerce conference room or something like that? Does that decrease your liability? Would that decrease your rates?
As far as not meeting at the home, it decreases the exposure there at the home, but you're still, if you're going to the chamber or just out anywhere for a coffee and you injure somebody while doing the scope of your duties under your employee,
Mhm.
there's potential for liability there for any bodily injury or property damage that may cause. And so that's
Interesting.
where commercial policy or business owner's policy would come into play.
And so if I understand you, it's really just because of the nature of your activity, whether it's business or personal. That's what this
Yeah,
is for. If the nature of your activity is for business, that's what business owner insurance covers.
Yes, it'll cover the bodily injury to a third party that may be caused by an insured, which the insured would be an owner, officer of the business, an employee, sometimes volunteers, depending on how the policy is worded. So within the scope of their duties of employment.
Okay.
So if you're just going to Walmart grocery shopping, no, your business owner's policy wouldn't come into play. But if you're going for a business meeting and injure somebody or cause a property damage, that's where the liability would come into play then
Okay.
on a business owner's policy.
So how is that different from professional liability insurance?
So liability, general liability, will cover for bodily injury or property damage that you may cause a third party. Professional provides coverage for any professional services, engineering, attorneys, insurance agents. You're providing a professional service, and that would cover for claims against failure to perform, um, breach of contract, breach of agreement, anything other than like a bodily injury or property damage, but may cause a monetary damage to.
So if you're an accountant and you give somebody the absolute wrong advice
Mhm.
by accident, usually, I mean, most accountants are
Yes,
very good, right? Then professional liability covers it, but not business owner's insurance.
correct.
Okay.
So it's a failure to perform the duty you were hired for. If you give wrong advice or failure, take the accountant, they just didn't file your taxes in time, and now you've got fines and penalties. Their professional would cover
Okay.
potentially for that. Yeah.
Okay. And I think you covered how it's different from your personal homeowners insurance, but just because I think you've mentioned that, if a client comes to see you in your home, you would be personally covered, but the company would not be covered.
Right.
And that's the difference between business owners and personal.
That's going to be a big difference is that the company itself wouldn't be covered. So you personally may have coverage under your homeowner policy, but in, say, an example, you have somebody at your home for a Cyber Wyoming meeting, they get injured and name you in a lawsuit as well as Cyber Wyoming. If Cyber Wyoming doesn't have a liability policy in place, there's no coverage for Cyber Wyoming.
Okay.
And so that's, it's really wanting to protect your business, your source of income, your livelihood. And that's why it's important to get that liability policy in place.
Okay. So it really isn't just a home business issue, business owners insurance. It's good for any small business, correct?
Any business needs it. If I think sometimes the belief is, well, I don't have a standalone office somewhere else or off location or anything. I don't need liability insurance. You do have that exposure. Not only will it cover for the premises liability for bodily injury and property damage, there's coverage for any product or completed operation you may have. So if you're making a product and sell it to somebody, that product injures that person, you want liability coverage in place for that injury. Personal injury, advertising injury would also be covered for that under a business owner's or commercial liability policy. If you're doing any kind of advertising, you get sued for, or any kind of publication, social media, and that you may get sued for copyright infringement or slander, libel. That's where the business owner's commercial liability policy could come into play to protect you as well and provide coverage.
Huh. That's very interesting, and it's a lot more broad than I intended it. Because I think when you think general liability, a lot of people think, oh, well, I don't lay pipe,
Yeah.
But when you think business owners insurance, which you're saying is very similar or the same, it makes more sense in my brain.
Yeah. So see, there are the business owners policy, and then there's a general liability, property, and auto. So typically, a business owner's policy provides property and liability into one policy. Covers for property and liability, kind of like a homeowner's policy for business, where a general liability policy is a separate general liability coverage and then separate property coverage. or auto coverage, where the BOP or business owner's policy will combine those into one package and provide some extra enhancements and coverages in that as well.
So back to the home office, if you have 5 home offices, like distributed home offices, and you are have people from Casper and Jackson and wherever working for you, does your business owner's policy cover all the home offices and all the
Yeah,
employees?
that's
I
a
guess all the
conversation,
employees.
to have with your agent and make sure that they've got the policy written properly. So you want the carrier to know that you do have these multiple locations, and some policies will only provide maybe premises liability and be that premises is described in the declaration of the policy. So if we have say your home listed as a location, but we fail to list the other 4, there will not be coverage there. It would be premises liability only policy. So it's important to just have those conversations with your agent to let them know, yes, we have multiple locations, we have people working on multiple locations, and do those all need to be scheduled on the policy. And that's
Okay, good to know. Okay, so the next scenario for home offices that I wanted to talk about, and this is really not just for home offices, it's probably for any small business, is, Rob, sometimes I use my personal automobile when I travel for work. And I might be driving from Cheyenne to Casper or something like that for a conference. And maybe I take one of our interns with us so that they can get experience and network with some of the people at the conference. What happens if I get in an accident? What do I need? What insurance do I need?
so for business, what you want to have in place again is the business owner's policy or general liability policy. And if the business itself doesn't own an auto, what you want to do is get an endorsement onto those liability policies for hired and non-owned auto coverage. So that would provide liability in that example. If an employee is out running errands for you, or you go and rent a vehicle, the liability coverage will be there for the business.
Okay.
In your situation, say you're going from Laramie to Cheyenne in your own personal vehicle and you cause an accident, your personal auto policy will provide coverage for you. But then, hey, it comes out you were driving on behalf of Cyber Wyoming going to a conference or a meeting. We're going to name Cyber Wyoming in that lawsuit as well. Without that coverage, Cyber Wyoming would be exposed without a higher non-auto policy in place.
Mhm.
So it's important to make sure the proper endorsements and coverages are there. If you don't, as a business, you don't own an auto, make sure you have at least the higher non-auto coverage. A lot of businesses I see is, well, my business doesn't own a policy. I just use my personal policy. I don't need auto coverage. Well, you do need
That's
commercial
dangerous.
coverage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned hired or non-owned auto coverage is also part of that. So if you rent a car,
Yep.
does that commercial liability automobile policy cover the car rental, and you can deny the car insurance that comes with the car rental?
Yep. So on the liability waiver, the hired non-owned, it would provide coverage for liability while you're renting that vehicle. There is a gap in that coverage, though, that that's physical damage. I'm sorry, but
Mhm.
for liability for third-party bodily injury and property damage, you injure somebody, that hired and non-owned, it would actually fall into the hired auto policy liability. That's what that would provide coverage for. So you can
Okay.
waive you wouldn't need to buy the damage waiver from the rental company necessarily.
So
You can get hired auto physical damage coverage as well to provide that coverage in the event of a accident and you damage the rental vehicle. It's going to cost a little bit more, but that's something that can be built into the policy as well.
okay, so it sounds like most people just cover the liability and property bodily injury and the property damage. That's you could buy that as you rent the car. It sounds like that's
Yeah,
what most people in Wyoming do.
yeah,
Okay. Okay. All right. That's really good to know, because sometimes I have been worried about whether or not the intern in my car would be covered And I do worry about that. And so a lot of times I will rent a car and buy all the insurance, the entire, like the premium policy, just to make sure that we're covered. So, and tell me about that too. If, if somebody decides we're just going to have a policy where you have to rent a car if you have other people, in your car, and you're driving somewhere, talk about that. And if there's any gaps in there.
Well, other people, if you have employees, interns, volunteers, anybody that's considered an insured, for their injuries, there's not coverage for their injury. But if you have a client in your car, you cause an accident, you cause a bodily injury, the client sues you, your liability would be there for that third party liability. It wouldn't, however, be there for the employee that's with you or the intern that's with you or the volunteer. They're considered insureds under the policy, and insureds can't sue insureds. So you'd be looking at work comp
Okay.
to provide that coverage.
Okay, and that brings us right into the next topic but before we go there, before we go to work comp, so I just want to make sure it's clear. So if you rent a car and you buy every piece of insurance they have, the premium package at, Enterprise or whatever, then your employees would be covered under that, but a client wouldn't? Or is
Well,
it if you had
I
your own
don't
policy?
know. I'm not familiar with each policy that the rental car companies have.
So we'd
So
have to talk to them.
as far as our occupants covered, if where they are not, that would be something you'd need to ask the rental company.
Okay, so always
to-
ask the rental company if occupants are covered.
Yes.
Okay.
Because it could be differences in coverage there.
Well, and it sounds like there could even be a difference in, if you check like that you're renting the car for personal instead of work. I mean, that could also be a problem, because if you check that it's for work, maybe that rental car insurance says, oh, well, Cyber Wyoming's liable too. Do you have this commercial property liability?
Yeah,
So that would be a good question to ask the rental car agency too.
yeah, it would. But the liability at that point for that would follow the vehicle, whether you're using it for business or personal. It'd be a question to ask. I don't know that it would really make a difference.
Hmm.
Um, as far as the rental car company's coverage goes.
Okay.
I don't know that that would make a difference, but definitely ask them. They should know.
Yeah.
If they ask you if it's for personal business and there's a warranty on the policy that says I'm only using this for business purposes, but you use it for personal or vice versa, how's the policy going to react?
Right.
I don't know.
Right. And so it really is a good idea just to have this commercial liability automobile policy in the background, just to protect the company regardless, whether you're using a personal vehicle or a rental vehicle, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yes, it's an important coverage to have.
Okay. Okay. So Rob, in getting back to workers' comp, and you had mentioned that, if you have workers' comp insurance and your employees are in the car with you and you get into an accident, they're covered by workers' comp. But in Wyoming, if you're in professional services, often you can waive that workers' comp requirement, because Wyoming doesn't require you to have it. You can just, not purchase that. Now we have, just using Cyber Wyoming as an example, we have two Colorado residents. They used to formerly be Wyoming residents, but we have two Colorado residents that work for us in home offices in Colorado. And I do have to buy workers' comp insurance there. It is a requirement of the state. It's not through the state like it is in Wyoming. So can you talk about the differences there and the exposure that we would have if we decided to waive the workers' comp insurance for these types of travels and these home-based businesses, and then just what's covered in that vehicle? Like if our Colorado employees drive up to Wyoming for a meeting, are they covered in their vehicle? So let's talk about that.
Yeah, so work comp is a sole remedy for an injury between an employee and employer. Wyoming does exempt non-hazardous professions from purchasing work comp. But just because you're exempt doesn't mean you don't face that exposure. You still have the exposure. It's just who's going to pay for it. Is it going to be the work comp policy with defined benefits for injuries? and limits to what will and can be paid, or will it be you, the business, personally paying for those injuries and be open to possibly a lot larger judgment or payout for those injuries of the employee? So yeah, just because you're exempt does not mean you don't have the exposure. It just, who's going to pay for it? I'd rather have work comp pay for it than go it alone and go to a jury trial and have a jury decide how much I pay. From the Colorado standpoint, you have a Colorado employee that travels up to Wyoming. You have a policy in place for them. For those temporary travels that they're doing cross state lines, those policies, like the Colorado work comp you purchase, will provide coverage for that employee as they cross state lines. There's From state to state, it's different as far as how long the employee can be in another territory, 30, 60, 90, 6 months, 30, 60, 90 days or 6 months, whatever. But if they're just temporarily going between state lines, that policy will follow them.
And even if they're visiting each other and helping each other with, a project or something and meeting at a coffee shop in Colorado, our business owner's insurance policy would cover that if something happened, as well as the travel with the work comp for Colorado.
Well, now if you're out, just two employees having coffee somewhere, business related, having a meeting, and they cause a third party bodily injury or property damage, that's where your business owner's liability would come into play. Now, if those two employees are there and they get injured while they're there, the employees, that's where your work comp
comes in.
Yeah.
Okay, good. This is clarifying a lot of things. I hope it does for everybody else at home too. Okay, the final thing I want to talk to you about is home-based businesses and cyber liability insurance. I mean, these are distributed offices. Most of the time, all of their stuff's in the cloud. They have email in the cloud through either the Google or the Microsoft suite. Most of their QuickBooks is probably in the cloud. Everything's in the cloud because it's easier to share from 4 or 5 different offices across the state of Wyoming. Is cyber liability insurance still applicable to that model? And if so, first of all, how would you protect those distributed offices? Because they're not as easily controlled. And then third is, let's talk about the premiums rising for cyber liability and what home businesses can do to protect themselves still.
So with the home business, you do have that exposure. And like you said, an open network. And the way to protect yourself is use a business laptop, business only. Don't mix the personal and business use. And if you're logging onto your network, use a VPN, virtual private network. We provide more security for you, as well as with emails and any accounts you're logging. Multi-factor authentication is vital in those situations because it does help prevent intrusion into your network. Now, if you're using a personal laptop, say a business, you're using it for business during the day, but then your kids play Roblox or whatever they're doing at night on your laptop, you're exposing your system to malware and viruses and cyber attack. So that's why it's important to separate the usage of those devices. But the big thing is a virtual private network, and make sure you have the proper protocols in place for remote workstations and that to seal or confine your network as best as you can and ward off any kind of intrusion from hackers.
So we were working with a company that was a home-based business a few years ago, and we found they wanted to institute a virtual private network, but they also had a virtual phone system, and it actually disabled it. They couldn't receive or they couldn't hear the caller when they were on a VPN. And then the other thing was that they had a very critical system up in the cloud, and the VPN would just make it hang to the point where they couldn't even function. So it was like a clash of software on 2 of their critical functions. And so what they decided to do was buy a firewall for each small office, and you can get them pretty reasonably priced. I think the ones they ended up buying were less than $300 a piece, but they were decent firewalls and had that. Is that something that they could do if the VPN isn't working with some of their other products?
Yeah, I mean, that's, make sure you have those in place, firewalls, your virus protection, malware protection. Um, those are all vital tools in helping to prevent any kind of intrusion or unwanted hack. I mean, it may not entirely prevent it, but it does limit the exposure.
Well,
You know,
and would the cyber liability policy also encourage the use of a password manager since everything is in the cloud and you could lock an employee out upon termination really easily?
yep, and that's one thing that underwriters look to when they're deciding on the terms of a cyber policy. They want to know, do you have these protocols in place, or policies, procedures, and protocols with a VPN? Do you have firewalls, antivirus? Do you use password managers? Do you have the ability to, as you say, you terminate an employee, lock them out immediately and disable their access? Those are all things that carriers want to know or want to see in place before they give favorable terms for coverage.
What about, so we were we're talking about specifically home-based businesses. You were talking about usage of don't use your work laptop that is provided by the company and let your kids play games on it that night. What about also the wireless network at home? I mean, does that need to be separated out too?
I don't, not necessarily. I think with the VPN in that helps separate that. Um, but with home-based businesses, like you said, you do have a lot more exposure because as a home, you're not necessarily going to have all that security in place. Um, the proper password protection, proper firewalls, and everything else. You've got your network connected to your Apple TV, maybe your refrigerator, your washing machine, and the whole slew of things that you can, your Ring doorbell. So there's all kinds of gateways and doorways that hackers can come into. The average person, a personal home, doesn't have the proper security in place for that. So that's where the VPN really does become
Make a
vital.
difference. Yeah. So if again, if you have a VPN that has that conflict, what you would need to do is go out and separate that out and maybe buy a separate router and put all of your personal devices like your washer and your Ring doorbell on that's a completely separate network, wireless network, and then isolate your work network completely if
Yeah,
if
you
the
can
VPN doesn't work.
as
Um,
best you can isolate it. And that's way above my head as far as IT and
yeah,
that goes, and how to
yeah.
fix those issues. But yeah, that's, you want to be able to try and separate that as best you can.
So the key word here is separate
Mhm.
completely. Whatever you
Yes,
can do to separate, no matter what it is, you want to separate.
yes, and especially if you're dealing with lots of personal identifiable information, or for clients or employees, you may have names, addresses, bank account information, social security numbers, driver's license numbers, and all that information that you're storing on your network for business. You don't want that. You want to separate that as best you can from anything that you have personally and isolate that network, because if a hacker gets into that network and steals that information, you are liable for those damages to others.
So, so what I'm hearing you also say is that every home business needs to have data handling procedures.
Oh, yes, yeah, every business, home business,
Mhm.
or whatever, you do need to have policies and procedures in place, and be aware of the fact that you have that exposure and do what you can to protect against
And
what.
that could include additional things like encryption, right? And
Yep,
password
yes,
protection on sensitive documents and,
yes,
yeah.
multi-factor authentication. Um, yes, exactly.
Okay. So really, okay, to sum it up for cyber liability insurance, separate and protect data. Those two
Yep,
things.
exactly. Yep.
If you do those two things, however you possibly can, you'll have a better chance at getting cyber liability insurance
Well,
and
you you could still get coverage, but you probably pay premium for it. If so the best you have your system secure, the better your chances are of getting favorable terms, the coverage you want, and a good premium. We are seeing. I have one carrier that I use quite a bit now that does offer some different tiers of coverage. So you can get up to 100,000, 250, 500,000, a million or more in coverage, um, depending on your needs. But every one of those, in many cases, want to see just some very basic protocols in place for security before they'll offer any terms in that for coverage. If you don't have those in place, they may offer just a very stripped down coverage form that may not include social engineering or computer fraud, ransomware, which social engineering and ransomware are really the number one hacks that are out there that are growing exponentially year after year. So it's vital to have those things in place in order to get coverage that you need to protect yourself properly.
Yeah, and you're talking about having those coverages in place and we have separation and data protection. But really, when you take all of that and put it together, what it comes down to is that the employees need to understand those data protection policies and those separation policies
Oh,
really,
yes.
really well,
Yep,
especially because they're controlling their home environment, right?
exactly.
And that it can't be a one and done. I'm going to train you at orientation, make sure your stuff's set up. It needs to be every staff meeting mentions something about cybersecurity. Have you guys are you sure your Microsoft patched last night?
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. And
It-
let's go check right now on the staff meeting on Zoom. Or hey, this one employee saw a really important or a really convincing phishing email. Let's go through it together. I mean, these are
Exactly.
things
Yes.
that take 2 minutes, but if you do it every week or every couple of weeks when you have your staff meeting, it really makes a difference.
It makes a big difference. And to change, when I talk to businesses or I'm at a chamber luncheon and I ask, does everybody have, or who is your cybersecurity officer in the business? Do you have one specific? And people, yes, most will raise their hand. Yes, we do. And says, does anybody else handle cybersecurity? And most of the times, nobody else will raise their hand. But I do that because you all are cybersecurity risk managers. You all need to pay attention and be aware. It's not just an IT issue. It's the base level employee that needs to be aware and understand the exposures and constantly look out for potential attacks and know what to look for. So the training is vital and important. If you do see, yes, that suspicious phishing email, get it out to everybody. Let them know and let them understand what to look for. Um, Training is the number one thing that can help prevent cyber attack. Over 90% of systems are compromised due to human error, meaning clicking the wrong link, responding to that wrong email. That is the number one gateway of getting into a system. So training is vital. And that's the number one thing you can do. You can have the best firewall, the best software protection out there. But if your employees aren't doing the right thing, hackers are going to get through.
Oh, wow. I think that's a great ending to our session. Do you have anything else to add, Rob?
I'm more than happy to answer any questions anybody ever has if they'd like to reach out. But always just talk to your agent, your current agent. Um, find out what they can do for you. Are they protecting you properly? Just be upfront and honest about the exposures you have so you can make sure you're getting the proper protection. The last thing I want to ever do with a client calling me if they have a loss is to say, sorry, it's not covered, or you should have bought this, or you should have done this. Have that open, honest conversation and make sure we're covering things that need to be, but what your exposure is.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I think that's a great last word.